Since COVID, it's become all the more salient to think about technology use, not just video games, but broadening that out to screen time and juggling how much time in front of a screen is too much. What are we doing? So much of our lives are in front of screens now. This is a perfect example. A year ago, we would have packed into our lobby and done this, but times have changed. So we want to be adaptable and flexible. But we also want to make sure that our kids are still getting the right experiences, adjustment, and also are feeling like screens aren't taking over their life. Dan, can you just give me a heads up? Is there an echo?
I'm trying to fix the echo, and also, Mark, are you able to share the screen so both Ethan and I can be visible during the talk? I realize that would be.
That I am not able to do. No.
All right.
It is just.
Hopefully this takes care of some of the echo. Is that better if I'm plugged in like this?
It's one screen share at a time. That's the only capabilities I have right now.
So should I share?
Yeah, go ahead. Or you want me to do it? You guys choose. Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, I was hoping you could.
All right, I'll do it.
Thank you.
Here we go.
Thanks, Mark.
All right. How's that?
Beautiful. All right. So technology use, it's more than just video games right now. It's certainly more of a juggling match. And I think we've all seen the not only the activities that kids and students are involved in, but also the vocabulary they use. You know, if you see, Mark, if you can go forward, advance the slide here. We've got today's ABCs, right? Some of these, almost in a humorous way, are already outdated, right? But the idea that kids have a different learning experience, have a whole different world than a lot of us when we were growing up, and there's and it's constantly evolving. That's one of the challenges as a parent and a clinician, is how to keep up with that. We'll talk more about that, but that's challenging in a how to supervise, how to make sure they're having healthy experiences online and not getting into something that's over their head. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk about some of the research and the background that goes into screen time, some screen time guidelines, and then in the second part of the presentation, Dan's going to get more into the nitty-gritty about some practical recommendations for how to limit screen time and those much more practical advice and recommendations. So just a full disclaimer, can you go back? These guidelines are pre-COVID, right? So you might hear that there's a little bit of that differentiation. I don't know if you feel it in your life, but certainly when it comes to research or data, that there are certain things that are pre-COVID and post-COVID and that have changed, but I think it's important to look at them both. You can see the World Health Organization, these are the recommended guidelines of screen time. Okay, so you can see before school age, it shouldn't be much more than an hour. After that, 2 hours of recreational screen time, 5 to 17 years old, is the recommended amount. That can be a challenge, as we know, and also thinking about it now, not post-COVID, I guess, amidst COVID, mid-COVID, that, okay, if there's 2 hours of recreational time and 5 hours of Zoom and another hour of an online class, like, wow, maybe there's only 2 hours of recreational screen time. But in addition to that, there's so much more screen time going on. And so you can see just some, and these are pre-COVID numbers on the top left, that older elementary school, middle school age is spending upwards of 5 hours in front of the screen. And this includes cell phone as well. And then you see that older age group, those teenagers, 7.5, 8 hours. So, one thing I would encourage you to think about is throughout this presentation is not just are screens good or bad, right? But finding the nuance in there in the sense that what are children, what are students missing when they're on a screen? And maybe the answer is nothing. Maybe the screen is able to add something in that moment, right? For instance, this situation here, you're all on a screen right now. Our hope is that it's worth it. The time you spend here, another hour you spend in front of the screen is worth it and adds something of value to your life and to your family's life. That is different than just being on a screen for the sake of being on a screen. So it's not that, oh, screens are bad, but what are we missing? What do we lose if we're on a screen a lot? And there is research to say that the more time that kids are on screens, the worse they are at reading social cues, which makes pretty logical sense. Screens have gotten better, but especially if we think about pre-COVID, a lot of kids weren't even video chatting. Maybe they were texting, that sort of thing. You miss a lot of social nuance there. You miss a lot of social cues. Texts have some way of getting some social cues in there. Were they being sarcastic? Is this a joke? And they've come up with that very clever emoji idea, which obviously have expanded beyond a smiley face, frowny face to just about any icon you can imagine. But the idea of the software creators is that they're trying to give nuance to that interaction, right? They're trying to give allow you to give a social cue if it's not clear. Sarcasm doesn't come through on text messages. So how can we make it a little bit more clear that way? Also, there's research to show that as kids are exposed to screen time, or even studies that have shown pre and post scores where kids didn't have access to screens and then they did, we see a decrease in academics. Now, importantly, again, what is driving that? Is it because screens don't allow you to learn, or is it because rather than doing another activity that's enriching, they turn to their screens? Rather than putting a little extra work into their homework, they immediately jump to the video game that their friends are on. They're itching to get on it. If we look at a little bit further, and I think this might be on people's minds more and more, especially as there's social restrictions placed, especially thinking back to April, May, June, when people were really in lockdown. Is there a screen addiction? Is there a video game addiction? Is that possible? And thinking about addiction broadly as what defines it in terms of tolerance, increasing the amount, withdrawal, what you're like when you don't have it, what you're willing to do to get that screen time. That in our worlds, that might look like being secretive or lying about screen time or sneaking screen time, in essence, willing to break rules to get it, just like someone might break a rule to get a drug, someone might break a rule to get on a screen. So we see these parallels. So depending exactly on what definition you use of an addiction, there's studies that show that 10% of college students pre-COVID meet the criteria for a video game addiction. That's they're showing that tolerance and withdrawal and willing to do things that break the rules in order to get their video games, in order to get their screen time. And again, it's what I think is important in that conceptualization is, again, what is the screen pulling them away from? It's not that, oh, I played 2 hours with my friends, or 5 hours with my friends. That doesn't happen in a vacuum. That happens among a system. And in college or in really any school, that's juggling. It's a balancing act with academic demands, other responsibilities, whether it's household chores, cleaning your dorm room, what is that pulling away from? Did I spend 5 hours playing my video game and 0 hours studying? That's a problem if that's pulling away from my work. So it's not a sheer numbers issue of how many hours, but thinking about what it's pulling them away from. And again, what is it replacing? And you know, what do we lose in that system? If we look at it on a brain-based level, and if we think about, again, going back to the addiction research and what's happening, there's this dopamine theory of addiction, which basically, crudely put, the things that people become addicted to are typically rewarding, right? Whether it's a drug, whether it's a video game, but in that equation on a brain-based level, on a brain chemistry level, there's this dopamine squirt, right? So that kind of is your, that's that ping you get when something feels good. Ooh, I like that. And our brains like that. And naturally, they will seek that out more. From an evolutionary point of view, that's been really adaptive in the past. And at times now as well. But here's the problem with our brains, that in a lot of ways are wired like our caveman ancestors still. And what I mean by that is, for instance, a caveman, he might or she might be drawn to a sweet substance, right? They find a fruit. Oh, that's great, right? That's rewarding. When they bite into that apple or orange, man, they feel that, they taste that sugar, and ping, they get that dopamine response. And that's a stimulus response system. Now, one problem is that in modern society, we have a lot of supernormal stimuli. So what that means is, it's kind of like you take the naturally occurring reward, like a fruit, and you crank it up. You crank up the volume on that. So what made that fruit enticing to the cave dweller is the same thing that makes the Oreos enticing to us in the store. We crave that sugar and fat because on an evolutionary level, that kept us alive. Right now, Oreos aren't keeping us alive. In fact, they're probably detrimental to our health on the whole. But yet the drive to seek them out is that, the drive to seek them out is that, is sort of on steroids, to put it crudely, because that would have been effective long ago. It's no longer effective. It's sort of like modern day society has hijacked that system. And if we think about that in terms of screen time, if we think about that in terms of video games are a supernormal stimulus. That sort of ping, or that reward that somebody might get from playing a game. And now if we think about a video game compared to a board game, for instance, that board game might give that ping a couple times over an hour. But the creators of video games have figured out how to hijack that system. They've created they're really smart. 80% of the time the games are harder, and 20% of the time they're easier, and boom, we get this reward. And the graphics are great, and they're exciting, and they tap into that reward and pleasure center, and they're sort of hijacking that, and they become this super normal stimulus. It's above and beyond, so people are seeking them out almost like they would seek out junk food, if that makes sense. Mark, if you would do the honors. So I tried to look for some research and data on what screen times look like since COVID. And obviously this is a developing situation. So in that way, a lot of it's new and fresh. So this, I want to be sure, you know, this graph that you're looking at here, you can see it goes back to 2018, which is nice, and then compares it to 2019. So we can see even without COVID, there was that increase of over an hour, almost an hour and a half, truly. And then, boom, you see that March 2020 estimate, right? So COVID comes, people are quarantined, people are on lockdown, people are at home more, and we see that big jump, almost 3.5 hours increase. And if we're looking at that, so this is adult. So this is 18 plus. So maybe not the population we are primarily thinking about, but I think it's important to show that, wow, and we all kind of knew this, I think, is that during COVID, especially while we were under tight restrictions, boom, we see that bump in screen time. And you can see what I also like about this graph is it breaks it down by category in the sense that, you know, what I thought was interesting that, you know, you see that big increase of live TV. Not necessarily would have been my primary guess of a big jump, but you see that. You see more gaming and more use of smartphones on there. You know, gaming's a little bit smaller increase. You know, I think that's mostly due to adults. I think that would look much different if we looked at it with kids. And then also looking at these categories, realizing, there's no category for Zooming for work, essentially, right? Internet on a computer, I don't think that, you know, I would assume we'd see an enormous jump, right? And so now if we think about, okay, I'm getting 13 hours of screen time a day, plus I'm on Zoom 3, 4, 5, 8, 10 hours, well, you know, there's only so many hours in a day, goodness, right? That's a lot of time in front of a screen. So again, you know, this was a really challenging situation. It is a challenging situation, and I've always been an advocate of flexibility in that sense. How do we roll with the situation, right? If we want to be rigid and think about, nope, I don't care, COVID or not, you get your 30 minutes a day, period, that could be a challenging balancing act and tightrope act to walk. Yeah, that's good. That's good, Mark. And Dan will talk more about, you know, how do we walk that line and how do we structure video game and screen time use in a productive way. So what is technology doing to our brain? You know, I mentioned it a little bit with the stimulus pathway that it's sort of hijacking. But especially when it comes to video games, I want you to think about what part of the brain they're tapping into. So if we think about our brain evolving from the back here to the front here, the back part near our neck are the more primitive or reflexive actions of our brain. So that's breathing, sleeping, eating, those sorts of things. All those things that we share with many other animals, right? Pretty much all other animals. And as we move forward in our brain, it kind of gets more advanced and it gets fancier and fancier until we get to the tippy front of our brain, which we call the prefrontal cortex. And that's where executive functions live. That's where thinking and planning and inhibition and all those higher order thinking lives. And that's that reflective part of the brain. That's where we think about stuff. And I know that almost sounds silly, but that's important as we consider brain development and as we consider the impact of especially video games on this part of brain development, because video games are tapping into that reflexive part of the brain. Boom. You're under attack, fire back. That's happening very quickly. Kids are learning to tap into that reflexive part of their brain, utilize that part of the brain, respond quickly to a threat. That's much different than that problem-solving part of the brain, that reflective part of the brain, where it's not just action-packed, fire, fire, fire. It's more of problem-solving. Oh, goodness, here's a problem I need to solve. How do I plan for it? Now, admittedly, some video games are better than others, certainly. But that rapid response is really tapping into that reflexive part, which truly is not what we're trying to foster for the developing brain. Like I said, it not only develops back to front in an evolutionary sense, but it also it develops back to front in a developmental sense, meaning that prefrontal cortex is the last place to develop in our brain. In men, it's not fully developed till 25 on average. Women, it's about 20. So women, and even you could see that in younger years, it's not sort of happenstance or just purely anecdotal that we say, oh, girls are more mature than boys or something like that. I'm sure you've heard comments or seen that or even felt that in your own life, but there's brain research to support that. That's why a lot of college students, especially male college students, still are acting like children, right? Because that part of their brain is not fully developed. That's why you can't rent a car until you're 25. It's because, not because of the brain research, but because of some actuary sitting behind a screen said, look at the accident rates and the damage rates. They drop off at 25. Now, I think, females kind of got lumped in with the male chunk here in terms of that. But again, it's interesting to see how when it comes to renting a car, which is sort of a random thing, but it's one of the last privileges we have as people, right? We can vote, we can drink alcohol. Nope, still can't rent a car because we know you might damage it because your prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. You are more likely to take risks and you are less likely to be cautious. Now, okay, so why does that reflective part improve brain development or enhance brain development? Well, if we look at stimulation in general in the brain, really what we mean is like those neurons are firing on a certain pathway. And they continue, and as we use that pathway more and more, they continue to fire. Now we've got a established path in the brain. It's almost just like walking in the woods. If you were to walk in the woods and there was no path, that first walk would be slower, it would be challenging, you might get stuck on some thorns, it'd be hard to know where to go. But I'll tell you what, if you took that path every day for a year, not only would you know the path, would you use it more efficiently and it would be less painful, but also just visually, you would see a path forming in the woods and it would be easier to follow. You'd have to think less about it. I know that's a weird way to consider it, but that's important because fewer brain resources are needed for that pathway once it's established. And what that does is it allows us more bandwidth, more brain power to think about other stuff, think about new stuff, roll with a change. Now I'm walking around the path and, a tree falls across my way. I have more bandwidth to process that because I'm not totally focused on the path. I know the path. The path is established. So when something changes, I'm a little bit more available to handle that change. And again, thinking about that development is the more varied we can make it, the better. Okay, so yes, establishing that path would be great for that path. But guess what? Our best course of action is to form many paths. So not just I'm going to go on my reading path every day, but I want to go on my math path. And you know what? I want to make sure my foreign language path stays well developed. Okay, that stimulation is going to be key because that's going to keep our brain active and healthy and be ready to use those neurons. Because there is a pruning aspect that comes along if we're not using that. The last note here, passive versus active interaction, that's a lot like that first bullet point there. Because again, what is that screen, technology, video game pulling for? Is it pulling for engaging that person, or am I just zoning out? Can I just zone out, right? That passive learning, even if it's learning, that passive engagement is not nearly as effective as active, right? That active interaction is going to involve some problem solving, some decision making, and be far more engaging for the brain. We can see on the next slide that we've got a nice brain here, as I mentioned before. So right, the top is that side view, the bottom is an overhead view. So you can see that near that, so we see the brain stem going down to the neck. That's that basic stuff in the cerebellum. So that's all the stuff we need for survival. But as we move further, right, we've got some language areas in there, vision areas. Oh yeah, a lot of animals have vision and language. And as we move forward, we get to reading comprehension, and then we move to the frontal lobes, which, as we talked about, that prefrontal cortex, so the very tippy front, is that executive function, that higher order thinking. That's what separates us from monkeys. That's why we can learn how to read and fly planes and think far ahead. You know, there's evidence that, oh, monkeys are doing better than we thought maybe, but overall, it's a world of difference. And also what I think is really interesting about this is motor speech is in that frontal cortex, right? So I was thinking about that the other day, right? Because our receptive language, what goes in through our ears, is in a different place than where our language is that comes out of our mouth, our expressive language. And I was thinking about that in terms of brain development and in terms of other animals. And I was thinking about it like, oh yeah, my dog has pretty decent receptive language, but his expressive language is really awful, right? He's got one mode for expressive language, a bark, or maybe a whine, 2 modes. But receptively, he knows several commands. So I know that's a crude example, but again, it shows that that's that advancement, and also thinking about fostering that frontal lobe, fostering that expressive language. That's different than that passive learning, even reading, which is a valuable activity. It's not necessarily tapping into that expressive language part. So how are we fostering that? And are we losing any of that while we're in front of a screen? You can advance, please. So, right, this goes back to my earlier point about trying to keep up with technology. It's really hard. You know, I started, as I started working with kids, I felt older and older quickly because, man, I don't even know what you're talking about. So, you know, this is half humorous, but I think all the more important as, you know, and I think we've experienced this during COVID as well. I mean, we've joked, but how many times have you seen an 8-year-old swoop in to rescue mom, dad, or grandma from a tech issue, especially after doing remote learning for months? These kids are pretty savvy. So it's not just the apps they're using or the social media that they're using, but also just being savvy with technology and, you know, knowing how to navigate a Zoom and all those things that we've kind of had to learn, sometimes painfully, throughout this process. Go ahead. Next one, please. So, you know, one thing that's important to think about is multitasking. And, you know, we've heard that term a lot. And, you know, in essence, people think they're really good at multitasking, and no one truly is. No one's as good at multitasking as they think they are. And in fact, there's research to show that you produce less quality material, you have, you're more likely to be distracted, and also so that's like a tolerance for boredom. You're switching, right, to the cognitive flexibility piece, and overall people just don't do a good job as they think they are when it comes to multitasking, and it's not great for the developing brain, right? It almost encourages distraction, right? So if we think about being used to multitasking and we think we're getting good at it, well, man, I've got my class Zoom up here. Maybe I'll multitask over here, right? I can listen, I can do both. People aren't doing a good job at that, kids or adults. So, another aspect of technology and developing and learning and thinking and education is this Google effect, right? We have access to more information at our fingertips than at any point in history, for better or worse. Okay, so even if we were to assume that all the information out there is accurate, and that's a big assumption, right? But even if we make that assumption, what Google often pulls for is, I know a little bit about a ton of things, right? A mile wide and an inch deep. I'm not really digging down or understanding this new concept. I'm sort of getting the flyover. I'm getting the Cliff Note version of this. And you know, thinking about more generally what our technologically infused society has pulled for, thinking about downtime and boredom. Those are almost bad words right now. I mean, especially if you were to float those to a kid right now or a student, they you know, it's almost like, oh no, but I don't want either. Well, maybe someone would say downtime, but certainly not boredom, right? Boredom seems like such a bad thing, but in reality, boredom is important. And that's hard for kids to understand and even adults. But let's think about a sort of a mundane example. And, you know, I think I'm guilty of this. I think a lot of us are guilty of this. Let's say we're standing in a line, okay? And, okay, a couple people in front of us, it's going to be a few minutes. Now, 20, 30, 40 years ago, we would have just stood in the line and sort of been alone with our thoughts, right? And maybe we wouldn't have come to any epiphanies or what have you, but it would have allowed us that time to think and problem solve and reflect, right? So going back to that different process of the brain, now we're engaging that prefrontal cortex. What's going on? What do I have to do next? What's happened today? How should I prioritize? Those are the gears that start turning during boredom, right? Or even in a child's point of view, being out, go in the backyard, go and play. Well, you know, if they don't have a toy, let's say at their fingertips, kids will invent a game, whether it's with sticks or rocks. And frankly, kids used to be a lot better at being bored, being creative, and coming up with those games, and being, coming up with engaging in a fantasy play, and really problem solving and being creative. Right now, it's like, well, what am I supposed to do? Right? You know, I feel like their creativity has plummeted in that respect. And this idea of like, well, I'm bored for 5 seconds, what do I do, right? So back to the adult example, we're standing in a line, we no longer reflect on our day, we pull out our phone. Text, news, what have you, your sort of app of choice, but we go to that immediately, right? The tolerance of boredom has plummeted for kids and adults alike. I'd love to see some research on that, some it's sort of like attention span, but just how long are people sort of willing to sit in silence, willing to sit alone with their thoughts? That's gone way down with technology. Social media is its own sort of animal in the whole technology and screen time equation. You can see my bullet point here is meant to be, sort of half facetious, where it's like, again, keeping up with the times. Social media, it used to be Facebook. I mean, even before that, MySpace and Facebook. Oh, Facebook isn't cool anymore. Let's jump to Instagram. No, Instagram's done. Let's jump to TikTok. You know, that's a really hard thing to keep up with, and thinking about how each of those platforms are fostering or not that social development, right? So what are we losing? What nuance are we losing? Mark, yeah, there we go, thanks. What are we losing in that whole process? And also in terms of not just nonverbal behaviors, if you will, like we talked about with emojis, but there's this amazing, in a bad way, phenomenon of what people are willing to say and do when they are behind a screen. Kids and adults alike. That anonymity that it allows, it can really encourage, or people might be more apt to say things or act in ways they wouldn't be willing to. So we have phenomena like cyberbullying pick up, right? Even worse than face-to-face bullying. People are willing to say worse things online, and they're willing to say face-to-face as they see somebody in front of them. We can go to the next slide, please. Maybe could you maximize the presentation if you could, Mark? Did we lose you? All right, great. So again, these are meant to be half humorous, but I think it speaks to the influence that technology has had on our lives. So there's this term, nomophobia, the fear of losing your cell phone coverage. While I laughed at that, I felt it, especially as cell phone during the blackout, or when we all lost power, I don't know, a few weeks ago or a month ago. It seemed like the whole state was out of power, including that with cell phone coverage. You know, between that and a pandemic, it was pretty touch and go. But the fact of when without cell phone coverage, without internet, it was like, oh my goodness, what are we gonna do? And it was sort of like, well, I guess we're just gonna live our lives. But you know, that was kind of daunting. And that was you know, I really felt that. Now, I think in kids and adults for that, right, some people feel that a little bit more, you know, whether they're driving and a GPS or just being connected to their friends. And now here's a new term that I think is very relevant, this FOBO, not to be confused with FOMO, but the fear of being on. And this is related to Zoom and video conferencing, and has become much more salient given some current events and missteps by some people that are in the news. But the idea of the fear that your camera might be on and you don't realize it, your mic might be on and you don't realize what's going on in your background. All those things we didn't really ever have to worry about before, or a lot of people didn't. Now they're coming face to face with it. You know, people who used to work from home more made that transition a lot smoother, right? But people who were used to working in an office now had to take that office into their home, and there were aspects of it that were sort of unexpected. But, you know, I don't want to speak for everybody, but that FOBO, or fear of being on, like, I felt it, you know? You know, what's the etiquette when you get onto a Zoom? Do you share your video? Do you not? Oh, did I forget to leave it on? Those sorts of things. I mean, and if we think about you know, kids in learning in school and learning remotely, what their peers can see of their home. Speaking as a clinician who's done a lot of teletherapy over the last few months, I've met more pets than I ever have, which is a great thing. You know, I see that as a thin silver lining of the teletherapy experience. And then for better or worse, even seeing, what does a kid's room look like? You know, in some ways that almost sounds inappropriate, but again, these are different times. So if a kid wants to take their video call privately from their room, I might see what's going on in there, or a teacher might see what's going on in there. And so that line between private and public spaces is all the more blurred, especially because we have these fun cameras and microphones that are all over our house, ready to pipe it to the next you know, video technology. You can go ahead. So, you know, some of the risks of too much screen time, looking at the research, you know, and again, I don't want this to be as in screens are all bad, but if we look at almost any of these, we can see how it's not that screens are bad, but screens have a tendency to replace something else. Delayed language development. The earlier that toddler gets the tablet in their hands, the less likely they are to engage with their parents or peers in a conversation. Okay, right? So it's not the app that caused their language to develop slower, but it's because that app pulled them away from an experience that would have helped their language develop. Health, being sedentary all the time. We need to remember that movement, even if it's thinking between classes, between school classes, where there might have been that natural movement. Oh, it's passing time. I need to just walk down the hall to a different room. There was value in that, and that's lost if we're just Zoom hopping. Vision's a big thing. How many hours a day can your eyes be in front of a screen? You know, if we think that bar graph I showed you early on, that was actually from a group looking at eye health. That's who did that study and presented that data. You know, so that's a real concern. You know, the blue light issues too, in terms of sleep and turning off your brain, if you will, and being ready to go to sleep. How is it pulling away from studying? How is it, you know, the more kids are on social media, there tends to be an increase in depression and anxiety. Okay, so again, I want to think about the quality of those interactions on social media. We might think, oh, there's value in that, and there is, especially now it helps us connect with people we won't be able to connect. I can talk to my neighbor just as easy as I can talk to someone across the country on a video call, and in some ways that's a beautiful thing. But if I'm just scrolling on social media, that's associated with negative mood effects. Attention and focus, I think you've seen that. It comes in a lot of ways. One is that multitasking I talked about before. Another is thinking about what's our threshold for boredom, what's our what's engaging. And if we think about video games, they are super engaging, right? Boom, boom, stimulus, you know, not just, you know, visual, auditory, points, right? Our a brain during a video game, a good video, an effective video game is being flooded with that stuff. Now, when I have to go do my math homework, geez, that doesn't stand a chance, right? That does, you know, and like if it was math homework or playing outside, well, that's, I don't want to do math homework, but it's less of a jump. Now to pull me from that video game where I'm being flooded, my reward center is being flooded with dopamine, I don't want to do that. And now we've got behavioral issues pop up. Get out of my room, right? Don't do that. I need just 5 more minutes. All those sorts of things. And Dan will talk more about the impact of that in a moment. Mark, go ahead, please. You know, one of the things that has come up with video games is the level of violence and, frankly, graphic violence that has increased as the graphics ability of things have increased. So have, well, that's come with some blood and gore, if you will. You know, the reality is there's mixed evidence of the research shows some correlation, not terribly consistent, right? There is this association. The causality is not quite established in the sense that, you know, are violent video games making kids violent, or are sort of naturally, for lack of a better word, or kids who are predisposed to violence drawn toward violent video games and sort of would have been violent or aggressive anyway. In addition to that, like I mentioned, just that graphic issue, it's pretty gory. I mean, they might talk about horrible things on the news, for instance, but they rarely show the blood and guts that they talk about on the news. Video games almost celebrate the blood and guts and the gore. And so, you know, again, not that all games are going to be bad for everybody, but the idea that there might be a high risk category. Certain kids at certain ages might be more impressionable or might be at higher risk in that respect. Go ahead, Mark, if you wouldn't mind. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to try to move through these efficiently. But these are the positive impacts of technology. Like I mentioned before, that reflexive system, that rapid processing, reaction time, those sorts of, you know, that I think of almost like call and response. Okay, boom, boom. That's improving. You know, maybe they are able to process certain stimuli faster. Some technology does pull for problem solving, even amidst the blood and gore. Maybe there is a problem we have to solve. Maybe it involves teamwork. Maybe we have to delegate responsibilities. There's some value in that in terms of problem solving. You know, and again, thinking about technology a little bit wider than just video games. How can it expose us to opportunities, experience we never would have had before? Diversity in a lot of different ways, whether it's sort of that international pen pal sort of diversity, or goodness, I can explore cuisine and make a recipe from just about anywhere in the world, anytime I'd like. That's pretty neat. I can learn about different cultures. There's value in that. So it speaks to how you're using it. Again, educational programs, I think is important, and a simple study that illustrates this was around the time that TV started to get real popular. So sort of long ago, back when TV came on the scene, you know, in a similar way to video games, it was vilified in a lot of ways. But what was interesting is there was research to show that shows like Sesame Street were really positive. Other shows less so, right? But what that gave us was some nuance. Oh, it matters what you're watching, not just that you're watching or the number of hours you're watching, but what you're watching is so important. There's value in Sesame Street. I think we agree with that. And so the present day version of that is finding the apps, finding the experiences, finding the social platforms that are pull for those quality interactions, those quality experiences. Um, especially now that there's restrictions on how close we can be to people. I would love to say, close the screen and go play with your friend. And you know what? That might not always be possible, whether it's because of geography or whether it's because of viral risk. Okay, so I want to think about it not as social distancing, but physical distancing, and technology can close that gap. We might be physically distant, but we don't have to be socially distant. There are people with whom I've connected with since being in quarantine who I haven't spoken with in a decade. And it's been amazing. It's almost given us an excuse to reconnect. I never would have said before, a year ago, I never would have said, you want to have a video call? But now it doesn't seem so outlandish to try to connect that way. So again, there can be an upside to technology, and we can use it in a positive way. All right. So, in essence, the research is still very young. Part of that is because things are constantly developing. Like I mentioned, not all screen time, technology, video games are created equal, right? So we need to look at the specifics of that experience to help get us a better idea of whether this is going to be helpful, harmful, or what we think of it. There's less conclusive evidence at the brain level. Some of it does speak to the pathways, like less myelination is happening for kids that are behind the screens. What myelination does is it sort of solidifies that pathway. It's sort of this fatty material that covers the neurons and really establishes that pathway. Imagine that path in the woods I talked about. You start putting up a little fence along the edges, really defining it, right? That's that myelination. That's not as developed if we're using screens a lot. And the other aspect about research, which is tough, is that a lot of it's with college students. It's what we call a convenience sample, where how are we going to get 100 people who are into video games? College kids are sort of an easy group to find. But the important thing is we got to look to the population we're interested in. We got to look towards school children too, because their brains are developing more than even the college students are. So how is it having an impact on those kids? And there's growing evidence that brain research I talked about, it was done with school children. They're starting to look at academic effects in school children, but that research is sort of in the works, if you will. All right. I think that about, yeah, right. So, there aren't any icons on the screen, right? It's totally changed. I don't know, has anyone had the experience of a young child going up to your laptop and try to smash their finger into the screen, right? Because they think it's a tablet or something like that, right? There's almost this assumption right now that there's icons, that there's clicks, but things have really changed. Sort of the default has totally changed.
All right, thank you, Ethan. And so the next portion of the talk is going to be some really practical tips for how to manage screen time. And this is broken up into two different sections. The first one is really how to transition from screen time in the moment to the next thing. I know that's an issue that's been a struggle for a lot of parents for a great many decades. And the next one is really the long-term conversation about, well, how do I set general guidelines for screen time? You have to know how to do both of these in order to be effective at managing screen time. Next slide, please. So starting with the tips for managing the transitions from screen time. The first one is, a lot of these are aimed at younger kids, but I think they apply just as well to older, teens as well, and young adults even. When it's time to transition from screen time, a lot of parents might shout across the hall, or even just put it on the honor system and say, all right, so you have 45 minutes, and then at 5 o'clock you need to get off the video games and do your homework. And then the parents are surprised when the child is still on the video game system at 6:15, 6:30 at night. And for the reasons that Ethan was describing, video games are sort of an addictive thing in the moment. And so the honor system of get off when it's time to is often not effective, especially for kids who have executive functions challenges, attentional issues, or behavioral issues. And so being close by when it's time for the child to move to the next thing is really helpful, to be able to come in and say, okay, it's time now. Don't just shout downstairs and expect there to be results. The same thing is going to happen. A lot of parents have come up with these different solutions to end their child's screen time without having to be present, such as shutting off the wireless in the house, or even shutting off the game system itself remotely. It's something you could do now, and I'll talk a little bit about these solutions in just a minute. But it's not it's not a perfect solution, and there's a lot of problems with it. So that's why being close by during the transition is really critical. Don't rely on remote shut-off methods. And next slide, please. So one of the big things about transitions is that often the child is not ready to get off of the video game. That's or the whatever else they're doing. But this video games provide a particular challenge due to their addictive nature. And so when a child is telling you not yet, a few more minutes, one thing is that they don't want to go to the next thing because the first thing is so much fun. But oftentimes there's this other element of, I'm in the middle of a task. And if any of you have been in the situation where somebody's tried to get your attention, whether a child or a coworker or a spouse, and you've said, let me finish this email real quick, or let me just finish typing this thing, and then I'll turn my attention to you. You know how frustrating it would be if that person came over and slammed the laptop closed in front of you. But this is often an approach that a lot of parents use. So what I recommend instead is setting an end time to coincide with the milestones within the game. In other words, the child is often doing some sort of game that has some endpoints or some break points, such as sometimes they could save their progress in the game. Sometimes they are playing with other people, and the game or the round lasts however many minutes it does, and then it's over. You knowing that information, knowing what your child is playing, is a very helpful thing for managing transitions. It's one thing to say they're doing their thing. I don't know anything about it, and that's fine until it comes time for you to be able to manage a transition for a child who is having difficulty transitioning. And then it's useful to know, well, when is my child most likely to be able to quit the game? Know whether or not they're playing a single player game, in other words, playing just by themselves, or whether they have other people on the other end of the network. That's going to inform how willing they are going to be to stop, and ask them what they're playing, or at least when how long are the rounds in this game, like when can you stop, that sort of thing, because it reduces the ambiguity when it's time to end of should I give them a few more minutes? I say it's time to stop now. The kid says 5-10 more minutes. Should I do it? Should I not? So planning ahead as you're sitting down with your as your child is sitting down with the game system or the tablet or whatever at the computer, and knowing exactly how it's going to end. So in other words, let's say my child's going to play video games for an hour, and I know that the rounds in the video game are 18 minutes long, for example, right? And they're playing a multiplayer game. Well, then it's useful for me to know that I should probably try to catch my child when he or she is finishing up one of those rounds at the 18-minute mark, as opposed to coming in, right at the hour and find out they've just started another round, and they're not going to want to bail on their friends. So understand that a lot of games don't allow you to save progress anywhere. Sometimes you have to find a save point, which might be another 5 minutes, and be a little flexible if your child is not trying to be defiant per se, but trying to just save their game before they quit. The biggest blowups that I've seen from parents, and not from parents, but between parents and children, have been when the parent shuts off the game while the kid is playing it. Next slide, please. So, especially when you have younger children, but with anybody, emphasize the transition to the next thing that's going to happen, as opposed to it's time to stop playing. What about, all right, it's dinner time now, or all right, we're going to go to the doctor's office and then get some ice cream, right? That sort of thing. That's the, that it is, unless it's, let's go get a root canal, right? Then you might have to emphasize the transition from the video game, but normally it is taken better by the child if you're able to emphasize the transition to a preferred activity. Next, please. So it's useful, again, especially with younger kids or kids with executive functions challenges, but with anybody, to give at least one reminder or warning before it's the cutoff time. If a kid doesn't really understand, time yet, if you're dealing with a 5 or 6 year old who might just be mastering the concept of, how long an hour is, right? They're going to be surprised when, all right, it's time to go. Wait, what? So give them a warning. Ask them, I'm going to give you a warning. How much time would you need? Sometimes, especially if you have a kid who's younger or has executive functioning challenges, multiple reminders are really useful. It's 5 more minutes. Okay, 1 minute now, that sort of thing. Next, please. A method that I like is the countdown method, and I want to emphasize that it's different than what most parents might do with a countdown, which is you got 3 seconds to get off that. 1, 2, 3, and then either do nothing or emphasize, some sort of punishment. It's not that. This is, you are framing the transition as the opportunity to earn a reward, right? So you tell the child up front that before we, before you start, I just want to remind you that if you're able to get off quickly when it's time to get off of the games, then you'll earn a reward. And I could give you some different ideas next time. It's usually, a good one is you get a little more screen time tomorrow, that sort of thing. So frame it as this opportunity to earn a reward, and then they're excited about it, as opposed to resenting you as you're threatening them with a punishment. And then the other thing, to tie back into the point I made a couple minutes ago, you start counting when one of these end milestones has been reached. So again, let's say that you really would like your child to be done by around 5 o'clock from the video game, so it's time for dinner or whatever. And let's say that they're they're playing a game, and that they're in a round with other players, and it's going to end shortly after 5. You're looking at you sort of know the timing, and it's not going to end till 5:03, right? There's no need to be rigid about this. Nope, it's 5 o'clock. Boom, right? That sort of thing. That's what starts fights. That's what starts blow-ups. So, okay, you sort of know the routine. You've planned ahead. It's going to be around 5:03. Okay, so at 5:03, you can then say, all right, I see the round's over. Okay, so if you're able to turn this off within 30 seconds, you can earn your reward. You can earn more time, whatever it is. Okay, 30, 29, and so forth. And then the child is able to turn it off between in that time allotment. You give them a reward. Next slide, please. You praise them and you, great job. You got more screen time tomorrow. Very good. If they don't, you don't emphasize the failure. You just say, all right, so you didn't get it that time, but that's all right. You do it next time. It's okay. You can try again tomorrow. That sort of thing, right? So it's the framing of the situation as a reward that is the key to this one. Okay. If you have if your child has experience with you counting down in an angry way or a threatening way, it'll take a little bit of time to get them accustomed to, no, this, I'm not threatening. It's okay. You just, if you beat the clock, then you get the reward. Next one, please. So this is just one in general that ties back into the things I've been saying. Front loading, in other words, talking about the expectations before a child gets on the electronic device is very important, especially, again, with a younger kid. Somebody who's 12, 13 years old, unless you've been having challenges, you may not have to do this every time. But with a younger kid, if you've had some issues in the past, say, okay, so here's your iPad. Remember, you only have a half hour. So how are we going to wrap it up when a half hour's passed? So sometimes you ask the kids, so what would you like me to say when it's time? And the kid will say, I want you to say time's up. And I say, okay, but what if you're not ready when I say time? And the kid say, I'll be ready. Okay, so what are you going to say when I say time's up? And the kid will say, I'll say, okay, and you could practice, right? You could practice, handing it back. You could do these sort of things if you need to. Now, this is not going to be something that everybody needs to do, but it's something that some kids need to do, is to just practice that, like here, like that sort of thing, passing it back. And this is a collaboration between you and the child. It does not work to have an authoritarian approach to this. It tends to backfire. Next slide, please. So even if you do everything right, understand that sometimes there's going to be a behavioral outburst, even if you don't shut the computer off in front of them, even if you give them sufficient time to wrap up what they're doing, and everything else. Understand that this is going to be something that might happen in certain kids, and they're gonna get pissed off, and they might throw the controller down, and and this sort of thing. Right? You are going to be better prepared to handle this if you accept with your child that this is something that could happen. So there's a couple ways to handle this, and there are very few perfect ways to handle this. But one of the things that is usually effective is to validate instead of arguing. Validating, I know it stinks. I know it stinks when you don't feel like you have enough time to play. I know that really is. I know how unfair that can feel. That sort of stuff. Even if they're angry, it's okay to be validating. It's good to be validating. You don't have to agree with their their behavioral reaction. You don't have to say, yeah, I understand why you threw that. Or I understand. It makes sense that you want to break stuff. These are things that are okay to say, but you don't. You're not exactly saying, yes, it was cool that you broke my vase. That sort of thing, right? So being able to say, look, I understand how mad you feel is perfectly fine. Your goal at this time when they're having an outburst is to get them back to baseline. It's to get them calm again. It is not to have an argument with them or to try to persuade them or to have any sort of rational discussion at the moment. That's when your child's in a different mode. That's when they're in conversational mode. I want you to think of an outburst as, a different mode where they're not receptive to information. They're only receptive to, trying to calm them down and get them back to baseline. So this is not the time to say, yeah, I know you're mad, but, I said blah, 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 and you told me that you were going to do this, blah, 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 and it's time for us to go to grandma's because you don't want to be late to grandma. You don't have to do any of those things to get a child back down from an outburst phase. Just say, look, I know how tough this is. Parents feel the need to sort of, I think we feel like we're not being authoritative if we don't say, but blah, 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 blah. You don't have to add that but statement to the end of the discussion. Just validate, and very important, maintain consistent limits. It's okay to be flexible about when your child finishes the game, as long as you have made that decision to be flexible ahead of time. So I'm recommending that you not have a rigid stop time of 5 o'clock. You might decide to be flexible and say, whenever he reaches the save point, shortly before or shortly after 5 o'clock, that's okay. That sort of flexibility is great. The kind of so-called flexibility that's problematic is when you've decided and your child has agreed upon what the limits are, and because of the outburst, you say, "Oh, fine, 10 more minutes and that's it," right? If you do that, that of course teaches the child that, hey, I just figured out a new way to get mom to give in, right? And that can ramp up more and more if you wait longer and longer before giving in, but then eventually give in. You're training them to tantrum for longer and longer, right? And if you know that they are a child who is prone to aggressive behavior or destructive behavior, it's perfectly okay to give consequences. What you want to do is make sure that those consequences are set up in advance. Know your child, know whether or not that's something that you have to do, and have a talk with them when they're in a cool emotional state. To say something like, so when we get off a video, when it's time to get off a video game, here's the expectations, and if you break something, here's what's going to happen. You're going to get your allowance docked, or whatever the thing is, or you lose your screen time, right? Set those up in advance. What you don't want to do is to set a consequence in the moment out of anger, because those are the ones that tend to be, the problematic forms of punishment. This is when parents hit kids out of anger, and you don't ever want to spank a child or hit a child out of anger, right? You want to be able to set up a consequence that in advance, and sort of know and have a plan for what you're going to do when it happens, so that you're able to act in an appropriate way, and not in a not in a harmful way, not in a way that can lead to shoving and fighting and those sorts of things. Next, please. All right. So here are, I'm going to transition now to setting the guidelines, sort of talking about how much time is okay, and setting those guidelines ahead of time. And I want to make clear that this is an important part of the managing transitions as well, in the sense that it's very tough to manage transitions effectively if you don't also have this larger plan in place. So if you have this larger plan for electronics, and understand the short term, sort of the in the moment sort of plan, then you're going to be pretty well set. There are 3 different approaches to setting guidelines for electronic gaming, and I think that most effective parenting styles would use these in some combination, but in order of preference, in decreasing order of preference. So starting from the best one, the collaborative approach. If you can do with just a collaborative approach, you don't have to use the other 2. And if the collaborative approach is not fully sufficient, then you can step in with a behavioral reinforcement plan. And if that is not working out fully, you might need to have a little bit of direct control over their video gaming. But these 3 things are going to be, it's very important to start with number 1, right? A lot of parents want to jump to number 3, and you're going to create a lot of problems if you do, and I'll talk about that next. Next slide, please. So the collaborative approach really starts with, just like it sounds, having your child be a part of the conversation. Have him or her help you set the guidelines. They will appreciate it. No matter what you decide upon, they will, all other things being equal, they will appreciate being part of it more than having something handed to them, sort of in a very unilateral way. This does not mean that you have to do what they say. It just means that they get some input. Ask them, how much time do you think that you should be on electronics during the day? Let them give you an answer. They'll say 4 hours. Okay, maybe they might say 6, but it's a starting place. That doesn't mean you have to give them 4 hours, but at least when they say, I want 4 hours, and you don't want to give them 4 hours, at least they're not saying 8 hours, right? Sometimes they might be on that screen for 8 hours, but if you ask them, they know that would probably be too much time. They think 4 is more reasonable. Okay, 4 hours. Let's see. Are you willing to do an hour and a half. They would be like, no, I can't play the game in an hour and a half. Like, as soon as I'm getting into the rhythm, okay, you can go back and forth, be willing to negotiate, right? And you might think, oh, well, then they're gonna get the upper hand, they're gonna win. This is really not about winning at this point. This is more about you and your child coming up with a plan that is that creates peace in the house and that is, good for everybody. So I want you to sort of, I would love it if you're able to think about it in that sort of way, the sort of the diplomatic way, as opposed to the sort of the more authoritarian way. Get some ideas from them about how to set limits. In other words, ask them. So sometimes I have difficulty getting you to put down your tablet. How what should I do to help you, right? And sometimes you'll be surprised by how good the ideas that come out of your child are. I was surprised at when I talk to children and their parents how infrequently this sort of conversation happens. So, I'll ask, so what does your child think about this? And the parent will say, we never talked about it. And when they do, they find out that their child has sometimes given reasonable ideas for, well, if I don't get off when you say so, then you can take this, take my privileges away, whatever. Now, they'll still get upset when you do what they said to do. But if they have given that, if they have offered that consequences as a potential consequence and you enforce it, they're going to overall take it better than if it's your consequence that you're imposing on them. Now, of course, the parents have the final say of how long the per day, right, and all the different guidelines and whatever, but the child is a part of it. And very, very important that the conversation happen in a cool setting. In other words, emotionally cool setting. In other words, not while the kid is in front of the screen, not in the wake of a problem where you guys have just fought, and the child is now angry. Certainly not while the child is actively playing a game, right? Because they won't be paying attention. So have this conversation in a time when you're both in a good mood and having a good time doing something else. Next one, please. So that's the collaborative approach. And in an ideal world, that's all you need. And the child is, coupled with those strategies I told you earlier about, they're able to manage that. Sometimes you're going to need a little bit more. You're going to need to have a little more formal of a reinforcement plan. And in psychology, reinforcement basically means a reward, but it's anything that you do to increase a good behavior, right? A desired behavior. This is not the same thing as bribery. This is more like the way our entire human psychology operates. I don't know how many of you would keep the job you have if you were not getting paid for it, right? Even if you love it, right? We do things because they give us something back. And if you don't get paid for your job, but you are enjoying your job and you get a reward out of it, then you still might do the thing. If you're getting nothing out of it, you won't. This is just how many animals work, including humans, right? So it's good to be able to think about how to entice the child toward appropriate behavior, which is, in this case, appropriately transitioning from devices. One thing that is very useful is to just set more screen time as a potential reward. So what you do is you set the default time that they would normally get to be fairly low so that there's room for them to earn some extra time, right? And have it still fall within your idea of what an appropriate time would be. For example, let's say that you're okay with your child having an hour and a half of video games per day, right? Then maybe you tell them that they get an hour per day, but if they're able to transition within that 30-second timer, when the transition time has arrived, then the next day they're going to get an hour and a half. Now that's enticing, right? I could, get 1/3 more, 150% more time for doing this. Well, okay. And then that's a good reward. Another, using the video games themselves as the reinforcement can sometimes kill two birds with one stone. So a lot of kids ask for you to get them a new game or to get them, give them money so they can buy something within the game. in these microtransactions within the game, which are when you get a game, oftentimes for free, sometimes you have to pay for it, but then within the game, you have to pay more money for different features, oftentimes features that are just aesthetic only. And these are very rewarding to people. And it's a pain as a parent to want to give money to a child for something that's some digital purchase that really doesn't do much. But if it's something they're willing to work toward, and something that can create peace in your house, then it might be something you're willing to put a few dollars toward. So this is one potential reward for appropriate behavior. Next, please. The other type of rewards, which are very important, and you should think about this in a larger context than just reinforcement for appropriate transitions from video games, is non-screen rewards and non-monetary rewards. So a lot of times parents think about what can I do to reward my child for appropriate behavior? The people's first thought goes to what can I buy them, or what can they earn as a present or something like that. And that's cool, that's fine, that does work sometimes. But oftentimes the things that are the most rewarding for kids are things that parents wouldn't think about. So ask your child what they would like, and have them think outside the box, not just, what thing do you want to buy? That's fine, but that kind of thing wears off. Think about experiences. Think about things that don't cost you anything, but that are very, very cool for a child. Think about, special time with the parents. If you earn enough points or whatever, me and you are going to take a 40-minute walk together, right? Something like that. Like a child might never get a time to be alone with his father without all the siblings there and without mom there. And maybe that's extraordinarily rewarding to a kid. You wouldn't know that unless you really talk to them. Think about these little things, like playing catch, drawing, like things that are not that exciting to an adult might be extremely rewarding to a kid. We have an ice cream machine that's been like languishing somewhere in the house gathering dust. If I ever told my daughter, like, hey, if you do this, that, and the other thing, like, we can make ice cream together, right? She would be so excited. Like that's something that's, if you, not something that you would think about, but something that's very, very neat for a little kid. All right, next slide, please. Oh, I was going to say that the last thing was that that sort of plan can be, you can do it yourself, but if you're having trouble being consistent and having trouble figuring out how to make it work, well, I put these in place and it's still not working. This is where meeting with a therapist, a therapist who's used to using behavioral methods, can be really effective. They can help you set up a plan that will be very effective. And the last type of method, if you have done the collaborative stuff already, and if you have set a behavioral reinforcement plan in place, sometimes you might need to resort to these direct control methods. A lot of parents want to jump to these. I strongly, strongly, strongly advise against it unless you have the other two in place. I'm talking about direct ways of limiting game time, such as taking the hardware away or controlling the software, right? So you've got to use these in conjunction with the other methods, not instead of them, because children will resent it. And then it's a way that you can avoid being collaborative and authoritative, and it causes more problems in the end than it solves. So there are such things as timers and remote shutoff for devices. So you install an app on your child's phone that doesn't allow them to use the internet between this time and that time. And if you have all these other methods in place and you still feel like the child is old enough or crafty enough to get to have their phone when you can't really monitor them, and you feel like it's a problem, then you might be able to use some of these methods, but you have to know your child. Having a 17 or 18-year-old, who has some sort of true addiction, you might want to put some of these methods on if with their blessing, in collaboration. You don't want to have a child who is too old to have direct controls imposed, and they have all these controls that their peers don't have, and they're resenting you. That's a recipe for disaster. So be very thoughtful with how you implement these. Next slide, please. And the one after that, if you will. So this is a a list that we'll make sure that you have this on a handout, so you don't feel like you have to scribble this down or screenshot it, of depending on what sort of device you have. Here are some different ones. There's actually one that that I will add to the handout as well. That's a more general method of controlling screen time in the house, called Circle. It's been purchased by Disney, so it's called Disney Circle at this point. But so depending on what you have here, and these are just some of the systems, and the next generation of consoles are coming out this holiday season, so we'll have a whole new slew of different parental controls, which are probably going to be similar to these, depending on what the device is. Next, please. It's just another emphasis that these direct controls are not the things that are that you should jump to. Next. And just a couple of other miscellaneous tips about electronic devices. Number one, make sure that there is a blue light filter set on the device at evening times to help with sleep. So if you have tablets or computers, there's going to be some apps that are either packaged with it or that you can download for it. The iPhone has a feature called Night Shift, which just comes with it. At a certain time, you set it yourself. At a certain time, the screen looks more red than it does, blue or white. You can download a free program called Flux, F.LUX, for Mac or PC. Android's got several different apps and features that do this. The thing is that this is not the same thing as brightness. Don't get confused. It's not the same thing to say, well, I turn the screen time, the brightness shift down at night, so it's less bright. This is not what this is about. This is about the color of the light. The particular wavelength of blue light actually wakes your brain up. So you're going to want to make sure that your child's not using any device immediately before bed that has blue light on, blue light coming through without a filter. And also, of course, the more time between the last electronic device usage of the day and bedtime, the better. Keeping those gaming devices in a common area instead of the bedroom for particular kids is going to be a huge deal, right? Some kids are okay having their gaming devices in the room. Others, it's not going to be feasible. You're going to have to know your kid. Okay, and next slide. Right, so just a few buzzwords here. I want you to think of mentoring rather than monitoring in terms of using your child's electronic usage, right? Make sure that you're sort of knowing what's going on and helping them understand what's happening and make sense of it, as opposed to knowing what's going on for purposes of, well, let me see what you're getting into, and you don't do that and don't do this, right? Look for the positives in device usage and electronic gaming. Think about the social connections it fosters. Think about video games as another form of medium, just like books, just like movies. There's a lot of differences, but there are a lot of similarities. It can be an enriching medium. It's more active than a movie. Some games have just as quality story and experience as a movie, or even better. And so look for some of the positives there. Think about alternative activities besides video games. So make sure everybody is involved. Setting no phone zones or times, such as meal times or before bed, is really helpful. And watch your own screen use. Oftentimes parents will tell their kids to stay off of their phones and then pull their own phones out during dinner without really thinking about it. Just keep an eye on that sort of thing. And next. All right, so the final sort of summation here of what we've been saying is, think about what the kids are missing out on by using electronic devices, as opposed to what are the effects of the electronic usage per se. Now, as we've said, there are some effects of electronic usage directly, but really the things that are the most problematic are how it gets in the way of the other stuff, of the learning, of the connections, and so forth. Technology, of course, is not going away. This is something that we have to accept, as opposed to just bemoan, and understand that the goal is really trying to moderate that use and balance it. So thank you everyone so much. I think that we have a few more minutes for some questions if anyone has put any in the chat.
Thank you, gentlemen. While we wait for some questions, I thought maybe I would also put up the poll that we had. I didn't put up. Oh, this is the right one. Hold on, this is the right one. Here we go. So I just wanted to get we wanted to get a sense of how much time people are actually on their devices as it is, and we already got some answers coming in here. So while those answers are coming in, feel free to unmute yourself at this point and ask questions. This is hopefully a discussion to have. I know my personal question is, I know we touched upon it briefly, but there seems to be a big difference between video games and other types of technology use. Is there a way that we can sort of, in our own minds, kind of differentiate between the two in our kids' usage?
Yes, and I think that one of the things that's happened during COVID is a little bit of even more blurring of that line than there was before. You know, back in my day, and maybe most of you here, you remember that computers were something that if they were present at school, it was something that you would use for, you know, a little while of the day, and that was it. And now computers are sort of an integral part of my kindergartner's academic experience, even before COVID, right? And then you know, forget having to do remote learning. I mean, that then, you know, it's always on. So, and just seeing the results here that most people say 1 to 2 hours a day of video games, and with some more, nobody's having a child who's playing more than 5 hours a day usually, which great. I think that in answer to your question though, Mark, thinking about you know, understanding what's happening and thinking about the different functions of those of that usage is important, right? You have to differentiate academic time from video game time, and you know, in general, a lot of the recommendations that I gave are useful for both. I'm thinking about the you know, you've got the overall, like, you know, eye strain and all those kind of things, but I do think that that making that distinction and understanding you know, what's happening with your child is going to be important when it comes to, okay, is a child doing a social activity? Is the gaming a social activity? Is the child just screwing around now? And I think this comes down to the whole bit of sort of having a sense of what your child's doing without being a sort of over monitoring busybody, right? It's a hard balance to strike, but kind of knowing that, I think, is going to be a big piece of this. Ethan, do you have anything more profound to add?
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I was just going to add that, you know, as you mentioned, part of it is knowing what your kids are playing, which can be challenging, but you can ask, and not in a overbearing way, but there's a lot of value in being interested in what they're playing. Frankly, even if you're faking your interest in what they're playing. Tell me about your game. What is it, right? It shows that you care, and then it's less of this mom and dad are coming in and clamping down. It's more of like a, hey, they understand what I'm doing. That will also help you understand save points and, you know, figure out that schedule with them a little bit more effectively. Another aspect that I wanted to mention are things like co-viewing or even co-engaging. Thinking about how games or screen time can almost foster that relationship. Again, think like, how can y'all not feel like this is a battle of them versus you in the situation? And it would be really great if there's a game that you guys can both play at the same time. How neat, and it doesn't have to be a fancy video game, but you know, I'm thinking about more maybe the simpler tablet games, that sort of thing. But if you want to do the video games too, that's fine as well, because there's value in that where it's like, okay, we've been playing for an hour, let's get off now. Or yeah, show me that for a few minutes. Co-viewing, yeah, let's check that out. See, you know, you can pretend like you're interested. Maybe eventually you will be genuinely interested, but it will help you join with your child in that and get them feel like it's a little collaborative, which, you know, Dan talked about as being key to that, you know, plan and the structure that everyone agrees with. They're going to feel like it's less of this me versus my parents sort of dynamic if, you are knowledgeable and even a little bit involved in that screen time. So there's room for that as well.
Yeah, I got a, so here's a question from Amy. She wrote it in the chat box, but I'll paraphrase it. She says that these days, the majority of the time, my 11-year-old son is at school and they're on their devices. He plays games during almost every class, but what can I do? And that's actually a great, I think, a great question. So they're
Good
literally
one.
on their computers, right? And they're kind of in class and kind of playing games. Like what can Amy do?
Right. So this is one where you've got this dual approach, and I'll say this happens both with remote learning and also in the classroom. I've done classroom observations where a teacher is just not as on top of things as she would have to be, and it might be impossible to see every kid's screen all the time. And they'll pull up a game in a different browser window while the teacher's teaching, and then so there, part of it is a classroom issue, but then there's a parenting component as well that could be helpful when it's remote learning. And part of it is having that collaborative thing. I think it starts with that. It starts with, so I notice sometimes you play games on here. Do you feel like it affects your learning? The child will say no, right? No, I'm listening, that sort of thing, right? And that's when you have to have a little bit of that parenting thing of, listen, I know that it feels like you're learning. I'm not willing to let you play games during school time. Let's figure out a different way to sort of make sure that you can get the game time in, but pay attention. That sort of thing. If you have a good relationship with the child surrounding this topic, they might be able to talk with you, and having that collaborative approach about, okay, what can we do? The kid says, look, I can't focus for this long. I'm having so much trouble learning and paying attention without something. Be willing to have that conversation with them and figure out other possibilities, right? Maybe it's changing the environment, standing up, moving around, finding a fidget toy, something like that. Maybe it's taking breaks to play some games in between, the classes, things like that. And I would say again, this is where there are these direct control means of locking down what you can do on the computer. And it would be a shame to have to resort to that, but sometimes parents have to do that. And, if the child understands what that's about, then hopefully they're able to accept that, my parents put some clamps so I can't screw around during class. Ethan, do you have any other thoughts on?
That's definitely been an issue with, because it's not as if you can shut down the whole computer if they're expected to be on a class of Zoom at that moment, even if they're at home, right? Or even catching them. So, the reality is, even if we implement some software that's going to prevent them from opening that browser or game, I hate to say it, but it's a cat and mouse game where inevitably there might be a workaround if they're really motivated, and then you're just sort of chasing this and you're going at it. But to Dan's point, like trying to work with him to solve the problem and, helping validate what's going on rather than coming in with this, you can't be on your game. That really, it's taking a step back and saying, man, sounds like you're pretty bored in class. Oh man, focus is really hard. Let's figure out how to keep you focused, right? Even when you want to open the games. I get it. But let's figure out what to do when you have that urge, right? And again, it's joining with them and working with them rather than just trying to battle them. Technology battles can get ugly, right? And and oftentimes kids are savvier than the adults at the technological aspects of it. So if it's a purely tech battle, we will often lose. So, it's much better to come at it from like hey, we're in this together. Let's figure out why you're doing it. To Dan's point, can we replace it? Is there another strategy? And also almost looking at like an experiment. Okay, what would it be like to pay attention for the whole class? How does that compare to the next class? Also making sure the teacher is aware of that. And can the teacher give them feedback in terms of, hey, you didn't seem like you were involved in today's class at all, right? Because then that might change their answer to Dan's first question is, do you think it's affecting you? And they're going to say, no, it's not. My teacher has no idea, when in fact, their teacher might have a pretty good idea that they're half checked out for that.
Yeah.
And to get that feedback and to realize that they're not just skating by and their teacher's oblivious would be important for them to know.
That's excellent. I appreciate that. Hopefully Amy does as well. So I got one more question here from Carrie. She says, I have seen an increased craving for screen time in our home since introduction of online learning. They want to go from school to a show, to a game, to iPad time. Is that a correlation? Have you experienced the same thing? Do you have any suggestions or comments there?
Yeah, Ethan, what do you think?
I would say try to break it up as best you can, even if it's a short break. You know, finding those moments to just say, okay, we're taking a pause, or, you know, again, thinking about like, okay, we're going to be on this. And then before we shift to this, we're going to do something in between, or just not even just like it's worked in. We know that we all take a walk after we get home from school, or after we've been on, you know, we've done homework for an hour, we're going to go outside, or we're going to do something. Having that built in can be helpful rather than this free for all in terms of screen time and just jumping from screen to screen. Dan?
I was gonna say that we just got a message from Karen as well. Hello, Karen.
Yeah.
About the idea that screen time. There's a lot of variety, and this is sort of goes along the same lines. And here she's asking about any tips to help kids understand better how to navigate YouTube, because it's so hard to monitor whether the videos that come up as suggestions are going to be appropriate or whether they're safe. And yeah, it's one of these things again where you're walking a fine line between being the kind of micromanager of your child versus being completely hands off, and somewhere in the middle, there's this mentoring balance to strike where it's being willing to, hopefully everyone's willing to talk to their child about even the problematic things that come up as suggestions, and to not necessarily there are some things you're going to want to protect them from, but there are other things that you might be able to talk to them about and say, look, let's watch this together, and let's talk about why this is problematic. If you don't watch it together with them, they're probably going to watch it on their own if there's something that you don't like about it. And so if it's going to happen anyway, wouldn't it be nice if you could be there, or your spouse could be there with them to say, look, let's sort of see what's happening here, and here's why I don't like this video. What do you think about it? And that's kind of conversation. And then hopefully the child becomes better equipped to handle similar videos that come up. And if you think about it, you can really categorize the different videos that you don't like into different types, right? There's the stuff that has degrading language and actions toward other people, toward women, toward other human beings. There's this violence. Some of it has to do with stuff that's of sexual nature. Some of it's curse words, and you're going to have different reasons for wanting to monitor it. And being able to talk with them and say, listen, that kind of language he's using, I'm really not comfortable with that, and your dad and I are not comfortable with that, and here's why. Those sort of things can be very valuable conversations to have. I think that being very hands-on with them, and even being willing to watch things with them that you might not want them watching alone, can be valuable to some extent. If you hear something that you don't like, you're in the other room and you know what's going on, you hear it, you could talk about it later, not in an accusatory way, but so I noticed one of the videos that came up on your YouTube, I heard them saying some words that I was a little uncomfortable with, and here's, what do you think about that? And starting that conversation so that it's not about you're watching things that I don't like, and and that sort of thing, because then they feel accused and then they deny it, and then it's a whole thing.
And on to answer Karen's question from a very practical level, I guess this is a little bit more in the direct control realm. So to Dan's point, maybe to do this next, not your first line of defense, but there is YouTube safety mode. There's also kid safe browsers that you can implement. So YouTube has tried to address this problem, admittedly not flawlessly. But a lot of parents have had that concern, especially with the suggestions that pop up. So they do have a child-friendly safety mode that you can engage on most computers to help keep that stuff appropriate.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much to all of our attendees. I believe we have to sign off at this point. I think we all have a couple of meetings we need to get to ourselves. If you have any follow-up questions, you can feel free to respond to the invite link that I sent initially. I'll also, assuming it's okay with you gentlemen, send a PDF of the entire deck and a recording of the presentation today. All right.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you, gentlemen. Everyone else, take care. Have an excellent day. Take care.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.